we're partnering with Utrecht University in the Netherlands that is sending master students. They do some follow-up work on the impact of the program. And it's nice to have those kind of partnerships because you also say the impact to the community. You know, but the problem in the media is the massive amount of negative messages around men and boys. And people start believing.
Then I have Geeta Sen, who's from Dawn, India. Also, she's a long-time, well-known face in the whole area of sexual and reproductive health and rights. We have Subhas Mendapurkar from Sutra, really a forefighter on the issues how men can be engaged in reproductive health and rights. We have Mr. They really give me easy names to pronounce. Mr. Dakshita Vikramaratne. He's from IPPF from Sri Lanka. And we have Mr. Desmond Lesuyane from Sonke Gender Justice from South Africa. A very much warm welcome to all of you. And I guess this is going, with this panel, is a very exciting panel. And without further ado, Yoni, you are the first one to speak about men engaged in sexual and reproductive rights.
Hi, everyone. Let me see how I get this up. There we go. Hello, everyone. So my name is Joni van der Sant, and I'm currently the co-coordinator of Men Engage at the global level. And I want to thank the organizers of this panel very, very much for giving me the opportunity to briefly explain a little bit about the SRHR, the Sexual and Reproductive Health and Rights campaign that Men Engage is developing. It's not finished yet, and one of the things that we've really been doing at this symposium, including last Monday when we had a breakout session, was to get input from the participants here on whether we are on the right track at all with the kind of messages and advocacy asks that we are developing. So yeah, it's a Men Engage initiative. Why are we launching something? Why are we going to do something on sexual and reproductive health and rights? Well, we found out that Men Engage has existed for over 9 years now, and SRHR is a really important area of work for many of our members, and it's also a global theme for Men Engage advocacy at a global level, including at the United Nations. And so it's an area that's recognized, of course, as important for many of the SRHR organizations and for women's rights organizations. And there's quite a lot of those organizations actually already doing work with men and boys on SRHR. But as we know, I mean, there's also some controversy, and I'm interested also to hear more about that while here. So some of the fundamental issues that are kind of behind this initiative. So what we see is that the burden of sexual and reproductive health and rights is still primarily put on women, and I'm really emphasizing the burden here. Also, we see that there's limited action on men and sexual and reproductive health since ICPD. Even though that was like a transformative agenda that was put there, we still see that, like I said, the majority of the burden of dealing with the difficulties around SRHR is placed on women, and we think that that has to change. Men have to take responsibility, but also that men and boys are also gendered themselves and suffer from the consequences of violations in sexual and reproductive health rights. So we see this as an opportunity, actually, to broaden the discussion on gender and sexual and reproductive health and rights as something that affects women and girls, men and boys, and basically people from all sexual orientations and gender identities, and all of us. This is really an advocacy-oriented initiative. So it aims to unite people at campaign level, so not necessarily at doing programs, but on building some shared messages for joint advocacy. So how have we come up with what I'm going to present to you? We had a consultative process that's been going on for about 3/4 of a year now. And that includes that we've been doing several focus group discussions, developing some draft materials and sharing them with those groups. We've been talking to experts, doing interviews. We've done a lot of like literature review. I see Erin Stern here is in the room with us, and she's done a lot of work on that as well. So yeah, just to share with you that a lot of work has already been put in it. Now that I'm actually like feeling brave enough to put it here in front of you. So this is what we've come up with. The name of the initiative to be Passion Works. And it speaks to passion, of course, when it comes to sexuality, you know, to bring passion back into the discussion, because it's very often been about you have to use condoms because if not, you get HIV. And of course, that's very true and it's very important. But there's also the passion aspect around sexuality that we kind of want to put back into the discussion. And it's also an area of relationships between men and women, between men. So that's where the passion came from, but also passion for standing up, for doing advocacy work, for being really passionate about, you know, this is just finished. The sexual and reproductive health and violations are so grave that we want to be passionate about speaking up against them. The works aspect speaks to, you know, it's time for action. It's time for action on the part of men and boys, and it's time for action on being allies. Then there is basically 5 key areas that we are developing messages and partnerships, or that we are going to develop messages and partnerships around. And that's men and the politics of contraception. So the politics, again, also speaks to the advocacy part, and contraception in the sense that you know, men have to step up also in taking responsibility for contraception use. And I'm going through this really, of course it's a lot more complex, but I don't want to take too much time. I especially want to hear the panelists here and the public. So I just go through it really fast. Men and the politics of choice speaks to men being partners. No, first of all, that the choice, whether or not you want to have an abortion, is with women. It's not a man's choice. But we do know that there's a lot of men around the world. I've heard 1 in 10, or maybe even more, correct me if others know the statistics, actually will be at some point in a situation where their woman, partner, or friend has an abortion. And so this is also to say, you know, this is going to happen in your life. This may happen in your life. You can push it away. But we also want to talk about what can give you the tools to actually have a really good dialogue with your partner about the topic of abortion. Then men and the politics of HIV. It speaks mainly to also men, you know, the suffering that men have also faced from HIV and AIDS. The pressure on men, of course, to stand up for condom use. Again, the dialogue about, you know, talking about this with your partner. Then the aspect of men and the politics of sexuality is basically talking to the importance of comprehensive sexuality education that includes not only sexuality and reproduction, but also healthy relationships, what is gender, what are human rights, so like a really, really comprehensive package, and that we think everybody should have access to it, and it's very important that men, and especially boys, get this kind of information from a really early age to be also good partners for the others in their lives. And then there's men and the politics of homophobia, and that comes from the analysis that a lot of the violence against LGBTQ people is committed by men and boys, and also that a lot of the sexist language kind of around, you know, we all know the examples. I'm not gonna say them, but even in male friendship, like there's a lot of like wrong usage of words that we want to address. So the final part I just want to show you really, really briefly is that we are developing these 5 posters around every theme. And the idea is that these can be taken up by organizations, for example, already working on these topics, to kind of adopt, even change the name, translate it to your own language, change the images, but keep the key messages in there, so that it can help organizations doing this kind of work, kind of in using these materials, and also in building, like being part of a global alliance doing this kind of work. So the sense of you're not alone, and making the connections between different organizations doing the work. So I think that was all from my part. I just quickly run you through the posters. I know it's too small to read. I do apologize for that. But at least you get a sense of where we stand now. Okay. That was all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joni, for your very passionate presentation. And I think it gives us a lot of inputs on how we can work better with men on the several issues you were saying, like contraceptive choice, especially comprehensive sexuality education. I guess it's critical, even more for boys maybe than for girls, to know what is desired behavior and what is undesired behavior. I guess it gives us a lot of input where we can work further on, and questions will come later from the hall. The next speaker I'd like to introduce is Gita Sen. She has been working for many, many years on ICPD issues and everything around sexuality. She was one of the main architects of the ICPD, and also she played a very important role on ICPD plus 20. Gita, without further ado, the floor is yours.
It's okay if I speak from here?
Yes, fine.
Great. Sorry, apologies for being too short to be seen, but I'm not too soft, I hope, to be heard. So,
that's the one word knows it.
let me start out by just disagreeing a little bit with something you said, Johnny. I wish I believed that that sexual and reproductive health and rights has been central to the discussion about the engagement of men. And I think it hasn't. It hasn't been, it's far from being central. It hasn't even been terribly important, I don't think, in many places. In some, yes, but not enough. And this to me is ironic because, in fact, and I'll state it, you can argue with me, I don't mean you, I mean the audience, you can argue with me about it later, but the entire field of men that this symposium is so actively and vibrantly putting forward wouldn't have existed without ICPD. In a sense, much of it came, the discussions around it actually were triggered off by the discussions around sexual and reproductive health and rights at the Cairo conference. And it's important, it's interesting when, and I'm going to take you back a little bit through that just so you can see why it's important, why it was viewed as important 20 years ago, and what happened in between, that there was a little bit of slippage and sliding in the way in which it's been conceptualized, which I do believe symposia like this one are working against. That is, they are really finally the way out of the issue. Now, as we know, and the Cairo conference has been spoken about many times as the one that brought about the paradigm change in population policies and towards a rights-based agenda. And the whole, the centrality of sexual and reproductive health and rights to that agenda came out of a women's human rights agenda, which had previous to that been just 1 year before that in the Human Rights Conference in Vienna, for the first time, in fact, 45 years or so after the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, recognized explicitly women's rights as human rights. It took 45 years to do that, and that itself was an irony, but the issue of violence against women as a public and as an intergovernmental issue came on board only 1 year before ICPD. To us today, to think that violence against women is not heart and soul and center and forever been there is ironic indeed, but it wasn't that long ago. So for Cairo, this was crucial because, in fact, Cairo built on Vienna. Cairo built on Vienna's arguments about human rights and about women's rights as human rights, and particularly the minute you start talking about women, yes, men, women, everybody, we're all embodied. We're not souls floating without a body. But for women, the body can be either liberating or constraining. And quite often it's a mixture of the two, and for many, far too many women, it can be more constraining than liberating. And we all know that, and that in a sense was what Vienna and Cairo and Beijing and so on were all about. Now, if we say that it came out of a human rights agenda, and I apologize at the moment, I'm just going to make those assertions, and I would encourage anyone who was too young 20 years ago to have bothered about this to go back and look at that history. Human rights means there are rights holders and there are duty bearers. And the real question, both in Vienna and in Cairo, is who are the rights holders and who are the duty bearers if we're talking about rights. For ICPD, women and girls were the main rights holders. And I'm going to assert that and assert that very, very strongly. It came out of a very strong push from the women's movement. ICPD was the second conference after Vienna where civil society and women's organizations played such an extensive role in shaping the conference itself. And revisionist history notwithstanding, ICPD would not have happened without the full involvement, engagement, and championing by the women's movement, by women's organizations. It just wouldn't have been there. Just as UN Women would not have been created without the women's movement. So let's, we need to, because revisionism runs all over the place, and in 20 years we get a very different perception of what's going on. For ICPD, as I said, women and girls were the main rights holders, not the only ones, the main rights holders against 4 levels of actors as duty bearers. The state, the coercive arm of the state built on Malthusian or neo-Malthusian population programs, and India was an example given continuously. India, Indonesia, the big Asian countries where family planning programs had been very strong were also seen as the places where there had been coercion. In India, we know what happened during the period of the emergency in the 1970s, but coercion takes many forms, and we'll, of course, in this discussion come back to that. So the state and the role of the state as a duty bearer. Second, the role of the health system and health providers. What's their role as duty bearers in ensuring reproductive and sexual health? Religious authorities and local level patriarchies such as our Khap Panchayats were seen as another level of duty bearers who needed, in fact, to be transformed and to change, because the devil quite often is exactly at that level of detail, as we know. For far too many women, they are the ones who refuse to fulfill their duties and who, in fact, quite often prevent women and girls from accessing rights. And finally, men and boys in families and outside in the community, as individuals, as those who quite often are responsible for and the perpetrators of violence, but also as those who benefit from a system of gender power and gender hierarchy that we for short call patriarchy. As the beneficiaries of that, quite often nice men who are pleasant in themselves, but who in fact benefit deeply and will not open their mouths when it's needed in order to stand against the workings of power. In ICPD, therefore, we came to ICPD with all of these things in our minds. And the section in ICPD, section 4C, on male responsibility and participation, had as its basis for action a clear statement about unequal power relations. It was not about, it put power centrally on the agenda. Its objective was seen as gender equality, not something like empowerment, which can mean anything for anybody. It was gender equality. And the actions were needed, it was said, at 4 levels. In the household, whether it was in family planning and contraception, whether it was in matters of child rearing, whether it had to do with domestic work and housework. Secondly, in sexual and reproductive behaviors, including especially, but not only, violence against women. Thirdly, the importance of financial support for things like childcare and the ability of diverse forms of families to take care of the people within them. And fourthly, the great importance of the educational system and schools to train boys for gender equality, not train girls to be more sensitized. Girls are quite often not the ones who need the training. They do need some training, but far too much we spend time training the girls and letting the boys go scot-free. It's not the girls who are responsible for gender inequality. In the key actions a document that was put out at the time of the 5th year review of ICPD in 1999, male responsibility specifically and explicitly took on the issue of masculinities. And if we now think about where we are, we see that many of these things resonate back in the Men Engaged. But it was really at that time that these were explicitly codified, put into a program of action, and agreed to by 179 countries who were present at that time. Now, what happened? If this was also great, then why are we here with a second symposium worrying about all of these issues? Because power was at the center of this agenda, and sidestepping power is what we all love to do. And certainly institutions and the powerful love to do it, and the sidestepping of power meant that quite often governments, agencies, and so on ignored, as I told you, the 4C section said male responsibility and participation, ignored the responsibility side of it and focused on male participation. First, and somewhat absurdly defined, as only focusing on male family planning methods. So we had lots and lots of work on no scalpel vasectomies and other things, none of which I'm against, all of which are great, and male involvement in contraception is critical. But when it becomes the only game in town, and when it replaces any discussion of responsibility, it in fact becomes a sidetracking because it's the easy thing to talk about. To talk about power is more difficult and more challenging to those in power. And then it went on to something which was a little bit more pernicious, I believe, to say gender means both men and women. So what about the rights of men? So can we please talk about the rights of boys and men, even as we talk about the rights of girls and women? I'm not against speaking about the rights of everybody. Everybody has human rights. But it turns out that in this field, the inequalities, the disproportionalities of rights are dramatic in one direction. In fact, in sexuality and reproduction, girls and women typically have all of the responsibilities and almost none of the rights. And that, in a sense, is the challenge that we've been facing all the time. So yes, it's good to work on the rights of boys and men, but not as a sidestepping of the issue of power and the misinterpretation, and I won't get into this, of gender, which is a term always meant to include and incorporate power, to be biological sex. So if you talk about girls, please talk about boys. If you talk about women, please talk about men. It's not about talking about this or that sex. It's about talking about power relations of gender and the fact that all of us are caught in them in different ways. And that's why boys and men with the best will in the world have to themselves struggle in order to deal with these systems of power. Now, the third element, which is crucial, I think, in today's, and in the light of today's context, and just give me 2 minutes, Frederica, is it's not only about men exercising power in personal and individual relationships, which the violence against women debates, powerful and important as they are, often tend to then sort of drive everything towards. It's about how do we transform individual men. It's about the fact that we live in a patriarchal system where those in positions of power, in fact, impose the gendered meanings of that power on everybody. Nowhere is this more clear than in family planning programs. For the ICPD, India signed on to the ICPD enthusiastically at that time, and I was part of a group that was set up just before and then continued more strongly after ICPD called Health Watch, a civil society group, to say, okay, great, but we know your history as the government hasn't been good on this, so we want to be here. So they said, oh yes, great, come on board, we want you to deliver these services here. And we said, we're not here to deliver services. We're not delivering services to anybody, we are here to watch what you're doing. And we're going to keep watching what you're doing. And in fact, out of that process, we got the National Population Policy of 2000, which is probably up to today the most forward-looking, even though it's not good enough by any means, much better than anything that had been there before. But we still see the resurgence of the two-child norm, incentives and disincentives, targets in the family planning program resurfacing as expected levels of achievement. And in the context of yesterday's and the day before's and today's news, we know that targets are alive and well. They're not even pretending that they are expected levels of achievement anymore. So FP 2020 and its links and its pushing of postpartum IUCDs. I can tell you from all of my experience in this country, I don't need to, it would be something dramatic that would need to have happened in terms of quality in the family planning program in this country if there is not coercion in those PPIUCD programs. You have the woman who is just delivered and who is in absolutely no condition to say yes or no, and you're going to insert an IUCD at that point and tell her, okay, now you can go. And I know exactly as this program, and we see nothing on the ground that would tell us that anything is happening by way of improving quality in the program. The re-emergence of sterilization camps. Bilaspur is the example of that. Little more than 20 years ago, an Indian filmmaker named Deepa Dhanraj made a film which I still recommend to everybody called Something Like a War. And it was about the family planning program of that time and showing, in fact, how the neo-Malthusian target-focused, incentive and disincentive-focused program, in fact, ended up being something like a war. A war on poor, lower caste, Dalit, tribal people, and particularly women. It's a war on women, and in this country, sadly, it doesn't seem to have ended. We thought for a brief while that, in fact, we were going to see something different. Urgent actions, therefore, are needed. The government has to remove. It is its responsibility as largely men in power, in health systems, as ministers, as bureaucrats, as civil servants, remove targets, stop the camp approach to sterilizations. It has to happen now. There must be strict quality measures brought into the provision of contraception and imposed along with the creation of watchdog bodies for who will in fact be watching what is happening and will have the power, a number of powers in fact to stop and to make public when anything against this happens. These are just two of many other requirements that one needs to put in place in this country. But for a government and a country that not so long ago in September was very proud of its mission to Mars, Mangalyaan, if we can put quality in our mission to Mars, we can surely put it into our family planning program. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gita. Thank you so much, Gita, and thank you to taking us through the journey, how we got here in the reproductive rights and health. And also thank you very much to reiterate that family planning programs have to be about choice, quality, and accountability. And also that we have to have men in place, the duty bearers, who are really looking at these three things in advantage of women, and also to respect all the women's rights and for the dignity of all the women from all strata of society. Thank you. Subhas, may I give the floor to you? And I'm sure you're giving us another passionate presentation. Floor is all yours.
I have some 50 copies of the write-up on my project. So anybody who is interested can collect it. Let me start from where Gita has left. ICPD, which was the most important document for all of us. Our involvement started in a century back in 1999 with a declining sex ratio, child sex ratio, and we thought it is an issue of governance and local governments must be made responsible. And we worked till 2010-11 to make local governments responsible for the implementation of the act called PCPNDT in India, which is for the against the sex selective abortions. And we started with something like 30 local governments and went to 250 local governments. While working on this issue, the number game was going on. What is the sex ratio? Has it improved or not? And then we decided playing with numbers is enough. Let us go one step ahead. So, with the local governments, we started arguing that implementation of ICPD document is your responsibility. Why? Because the preamble of Constitution of India speaks about equality. And how the two documents relate each other, they link each other, has to be explained to the local governments. So with the 300 local government institutions, which are patriarchal in a sense, because all government institutions are patriarchal, controlled by the men, and largely controlled or involvement of patriarchal women into this. That is the basic challenge before us. So we decided to work on that. The second challenge before us was reproductive health services, contraception. How do you make this, its movement from the private domain to the community domain? That was another challenge for us. So the first we started talking with the local representatives, and given the credibility or uncredibility of our institutions for last 35 years, we were able to establish a dialogue with 300 local governments, what we call panchayats. We spoke with large number of old age women, and we said, will you please come to the meeting of the newly married women and speak about your experiences for adopting certain type of contraceptives. They were readily agreed, and we held n number of workshops between the two. The young women, recently married women, were not spoken much, but the older woman kept on saying that if the way sterilization has destroyed her body, sterilization then followed by the hysterectomy and then psychosomatic problems that are created among the women. So continuous dialogue went on. So that shift from a private to the community domain largely was successful. But real challenge was, how do you take the government, local government, to work on ICPD or reproductive health and sexual rights? So initial phase was involvement. We started involving them. The mindset was health. Health is a medical problem. It is an individual problem. Panchayat has nothing to do with it. So breaking that barrier. Then from involvement, how do we become responsible? All the women, men, boys, girls get reproductive health care services from the government institutions, and they do get it is the responsibility of the local government. That shift again took about a year to us. From responsibility, we moved to making health functionaries accountable to the local government. That was another second phase. From there, the last phase in it was, how do you make local governments accountable to the people? So that there is no sensitivity involved in it. Remember, sensitization we have done for ages. We want accountability. How? If you are our government, we have voted to you, you have taken an oath that you will remain honest to the Constitution of India. This is what the preamble of the Constitution of India says. This is the international convention whose implementation becomes your duty. You are a duty bearer. All international conventions signed, agreed and signed